Good morning and welcome to Inside the Middle East Q&A series at the Middle East Initiative. My name is Kristen Wagner at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and an editor for the Journal for Middle Eastern Politics and Policy. Today, we're pleased to be joined by the former Foreign Minister of Egypt, His Excellency Nabil Fahmy. So I'd like to start off with a question about Egypt specifically. Where is Egypt in the trajectory of its transition? And what are the biggest successes of the past year? And what are the biggest obstacles in the near future?
The publicly announced trajectory is basically 3 steps. Putting together a new constitution, that was achieved. Electing a new president, that was achieved. And thirdly, electing a parliament, which hopefully will be achieved by the end of summer to hold its first session sometime in the fall of this year. That being said, these are what I call the institution building trajectories. I think it's also important to take into account that a serious effort is being made to enhance security. And there's been progress, serious progress in that respect, although there are still some problems. There's been a courageous new posture in terms of dealing with our economic problems directly, including revenue sources and limiting the budgetary expenses, specifically reducing subsidies. And thirdly, bringing society together and creating a new political system. On that count in particular, we need to do a lot more work.
What kind of work would you suggest needs to be done?
Well, as soon as we get the parliament together, we'll then have a forum for different political opinions that is more institutional. And it's important to sort of bring in the different members of our society. Anyone who is ready to be Egyptian first and ideologically second and work within the law should be welcome in the system.
And as I understand it, this was the case beforehand, right? That people identified themselves as Egyptian first, ideologically second, and that's changed in the past few years.
That's changed specifically with the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood versus a secular system. If you put your nationality first and are ready to work within the constitution, then what your political inclination is of your concern, not mine. Mm-hmm. If, on the other hand, your commitment is to something beyond the state of Egypt, then there's a conflict of interest here between your goals and that of the country. And that's really where the challenge is. We need to come together more and more. We're on track. We're building the institutions. But as much as we were all extremely enthusiastic with the 2 revolutions we've had, especially the first one where there was no contention whatsoever, but both of them, frankly, they're about nation building. And people, I think, were a bit too naive to think that you can construct a new nation, a new state, in a matter of months or weeks. It really takes a longer period of time.
So on that note, speaking of nation building, what do you think about the proposed new capital city in Egypt? And where does that fit in the process, actually, if at all?
Well, if you've just traveled around Cairo, we used to say during rush hours, now it's any time during the day, it's quite congested. And there has to be attempts to sort of move some of the services out of Cairo. So to do that by creating a new capital is a good idea in principle. We, however, will be making a huge mistake if we don't build the infrastructure, public transportation system before we build the capital. So I'm all for building an administrative capital, but provided that we first do the public transportation system so we don't end up creating more roads and having more cars.
Right. And how soon do you think that kind of a project could realistically be achieved?
20 years.
Okay.
To be finished, not
to
start,
yeah.
20 years.
Okay, now I'm going to switch a little bit to more foreign relations, which I know is your domain. First of all, what's the Egyptian perspective of the Iran deal? And does Egypt have a stake in it? And what is the preference in the outcome?
Since I'm not a member of government, let me say my perspective as an Egyptian rather than the Egyptian perspective. Look, we have always been progressive on arms control and disarmament. So if there's any agreement that is technically sound, reducing non-proliferation, or proliferation in the Middle East, we're supportive of that. But first of all, it has to be technically sound in its final form when it's signed. The framework agreement is a step in the right direction. So my first condition is the details have to be technically sound. Secondly, it's not only about the technicality of the proliferation or the lack of it, it's also about what happens after that. In other words, does it lead to states in the region, particularly Iran, playing a more worldly, constructive role, or does it lead to Iran feeling it has now the confidence and the liberty to be more aggressive in Middle Eastern politics? That will determine its comprehensive effects on the regional politics. But if we have good disarmament agreements and the politics are consistent with that thereafter, it's a good direction.
Okay. And my last question for you is about the situation in Yemen. What are the implications of having formed this joint coalition of Arab forces to respond to the conflict in Yemen?
I've always been an activist in terms of foreign policy, and that means at certain points in time you have to put your assets behind your policy. I'm not at all, nor will I ever be, proposing the irrational use of force or the using force if there are any other options. That being said, there will be situations where there are threats that require the use of force. I'm supportive of the intervention so far and our participation in the intervention so far as air and naval intervention. But it needs to be coupled. Again, there has to be a vision of the day after. Okay, you change the situation on the ground militarily, but then you have to add quickly a political process after that to resolve it. None of these problems in the region can be resolved without the potential of use of force, but they cannot be resolved by force. So they have to be leading into a political process.
Do you think Egypt would be willing to participate in the development of that political process in Yemen once the conflict is over?
I would hope so, yes.
Okay. In what capacity?
We are the head of the Arab Summit now. So the President of Egypt has the responsibility as the head of the Arab Summit to play the lead in trying to pursue peaceful resolution of conflicts throughout the Arab world. So he should play a primary role as the head of the Arab Summit.
And so in regards to the Saudi-Egyptian relationship, how will that develop in the context of the conflict and the joint coalition?
I have no concern whatsoever regarding the relationship in its strategic context. We both need each other. We both have a overlapping interests that are grosso modo quite common. Even if we differ on one point or the other, that's not going to affect the overall relationship. But as head of the Arab Summit, we will consult with all the parties, especially the Saudis and the Gulf states being there, but also the Yemenis to try to move this forward.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your time.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me.
Until next time.